agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, well, good afternoon, Mike.
Hey, how are you doing this afternoon, Jay?
I am more psyched for this weekend than Disinformation Czar Nina Jankowicz at community theater auditions.
Man, you had that one all teed up. I like it. Well, I am excited, in a pretty good mood as well. I got done with my end of the semester grading, and that's always a very positive sort of thing. So I'm looking forward to talking about a bunch of stuff with you today. We're going to talk about sort of the post-Roe landscape as we see it, some primary elections this last week and what it may or may not say about Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party, the COVID summit just a few days ago, situation as it develops with Ukraine and Russia, inflation, the market's not looking so great, and maybe if we should reconsider those China tariffs, and why I might be leaving the country for good in a few years.
No.
But there's always the internet, so I won't be leaving you, Jay, or listeners. So there we go. Anyway, we're going to tackle as much of that as we can. Before we do, we'll just take one quick pause and be right back to start things off. All right, Jay, I realized I forgot to mention something to you and to the listeners as well, is that our schedule is going to change a little bit. Normally, we'd be doing the show next week, but actually Trey and Ken are going to be on. And that's because I have jury duty coming up for the next couple of weeks. And so this will be a first for me. I know you spend a lot of time in the courtroom, but
I do.
Yeah, me.
Well, no, although not. Here's the thing. It's weird. Actually, not as much time in the courtroom as you'd think, because so much stuff happens outside.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
All of my time will be in the. Well, it depends. It depends, because my wife had jury duty a few years ago, but she actually was dismissed when she was asked about how she felt about guns. She mentioned that she felt that the Supreme Court got it wrong in Heller, and next thing she knows, she was dismissed. So I filed that away. I also thought I might mention my agreement with Justice Sotomayor about there being a proper place for jury nullification, and kind of see how that goes over. So I don't know.
So what kind of jury are you going to be on?
This is just the regular old. What's it? Is it the key? Is it the
Senate jury?
Yeah, there you go.
Hamilton County.
There you go, for Hamilton County. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So the next 2 weeks up to they say so. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It should be an interesting experience. So yeah, and there's, I think, $19 a day, I believe. It's so there you go, to sock that jury pay away. But anyway, it was interesting. I when in kind of thinking about this and looking into jury nullification. Not that I think it's probably going to come up, but and I found Justice Sotomayor's comment on that, and it turns out in looking at that, I realized that she's actually the only currently serving justice who's presided over a jury trial, which I don't know. I found that I was a little bit surprised by that. Maybe you're not as surprised as I am.
No.
But yeah, now next term there will be a second justice with trial court experience, because Justice Jackson was a judge on the D.C. District Court. But yeah, aside from that, it's pretty much it's either appellate court, the Supreme Court, or something else, like it was Kagan was a former Solicitor General, but pretty much the way through is through a circuit court without any trial court experience. So, I wanted to get your take on that. Do you think that matters at all? That, in the past, we used to talk occasionally about the fact that none of the justices had served in legislatures. Now, Justice O'Connor back in the day was in the Arizona state legislature, but do you think that matters at all? We always talk about how weird the justices are in so many ways. Is that a difference that makes a difference, do you think?
Not to me, not really. And I'll tell you why. Just because of the roles that they're playing are different. Now, I guess is it better to say, listen, you've had trial judge experience, so that sort of informs your opinion as to how things actually happen and how things actually happened at the trial level. No, maybe. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt, right? But I don't think it gives you, when you're talking about pure questions of law, which is typically what's before the appeals courts and the Supreme Court. Those day to day, the mechanics of running a courtroom, don't I don't know that gives you that much, right? And if you practice law, I think that certainly helps as well. But still, it's just kind of it's a different job.
Yeah, and that kind of was my sense, is that it might help. It can't hurt, but it doesn't necessarily help all that much, I guess, was sort of my sense of that. But it's interesting because I looked for what the reason I came across this is I was looking for what Supreme Court justices might have had to say about jury nullification, because I was just curious about that, given where I'm going to be. And Justice Sotomayor was the only one I could find.
You're really planning ahead.
Oh yeah, I got the
ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't know. I actually am sort of in favor of jury nullification, and so I think Justice Sotomayor is right about that. And she was talking about it in the context of some juries in the context of the civil rights movement and that, and just not wanting to convict people on unjust laws. And I think there is actually something to be said for that. Now, this is not the sort of thing I've ever had to think about before, but it's something that might have been an issue for you, at least conceivably. And do you think that jury nullification is ever an okay thing? I guess we should tell listeners what that is, but you probably have a better way of putting that than I would. Imagine.
So yeah, I mean, jury nullification is essentially when a jury just makes up its mind that despite facts or evidence or how it's been instructed, it's going to take a certain position, right?
Contrary to those facts, yeah.
For example, I mean, now as a practitioner, that it certainly troubles me, right?
I would imagine, yeah.
Because this is the way the system's supposed to function, and the jury is to be the finder of facts, and so to some extent, finding of facts, they can fact find and come up with as goofy fact findings as they want. That's their province. But they're also supposed to, if they find certain facts, this is what you rule on the law as they're instructed by the judge. So that's troubling if you're not doing what the judge says. But all that said, there's sort of a black box, right? That happens, and the jury can just decide we're not going to find these facts, and therefore we won't reach those conclusions. My sense is it happens very rarely. When it's an actual, nullification, right? When it's really you have the jury that says we absolutely think this guy did it, guilty as hell, but we're not going to convict because we don't like the crime. Has that happened before, or we're not going to convict to make some other point, right? I mean, has it happened? Certainly. Does it happen often? No. And when it happens, I mean, the jury, I don't think, calls it jury nullification.
No.
They just call it, this is how we see it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so from a practitioner standpoint, no, I'm certainly not crazy about it, because it sort of means all you're doing could be for naught, and it tends to fly in the face of the rule of law. As a citizen, I don't feel as bad about it, right? Because it does give those sort of outs occasionally, particularly in criminal convictions. I mean, the bigger trouble for me, and maybe this is just how my mind works, is mostly what I do is civil, is if you get a jury that is kind of a runaway jury that's going to we're going to rule against this corporation because they're a corporation.
And $18 trillion, yeah.
We're going to get these guys because they got the money.
That gets overturned on appeal anyway, or reduced, right?
Yeah, so that's that kind of thing would be troubling to me, more troubling to me. But I think it does provide an important safeguard. And this is why, and I mean, the jury system was so important to the founders, because coming out of the system that they had seen in 16th, 17th century England, right? The ability of a jury to safeguard someone's freedom was a really big deal. So yeah, I also see it. Yeah, so more in the criminal context to prevent against government abuses. But
So maybe I will have the opportunity to safeguard someone's freedom, or maybe it will never get to that point. But either way, I will report back on my jury duty experience here. So anyway, but I just thought I'd bring that up because I was just curious about jury nullification and your thoughts on it. So anyway, well, we're going to stick with the courts, actually. Well, in a way, last week, right, Trey and Ken discussed the legal reasoning of Justice Alito's leaked draft opinion overturning Roe versus Wade, and as well as the really extraordinary fact that the draft was leaked in the first place. And I thought, we can talk about the opinion as well as any dissents that there certainly will be and concurrences. I think when the court issues them officially in a month and a half, something like that, probably I would guess is when that's going to come out. But I wanted to hold off on that, especially in light of the fact that that Trey and Ken talked about the opinion itself, or the draft, sorry. But for now, I think what seems almost certain, at least seems almost certain to me, is that Roe will in fact be overturned, meaning that the court will hold that there is no constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy. So let's start there. I guess, do you agree with that, Jay? I mean, if that's going to happen, okay. Because there is this school of there's this not school of thought, but there are some folks who think maybe that Chief Justice Roberts can somehow end up persuading at least one of his colleagues further on the right that the majority should uphold Mississippi's law, and not completely overturn Roe.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you thread that needle.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think.
Again, I mean, Justice Roberts is much smarter than I am, so maybe he does have a plan as to how to thread that needle. But I don't know that there is.
I think if you look back to the oral arguments in this case, Roberts seemed to be pretty clearly inclined to accept Mississippi's argument about there being important physiological developments in the fetus by 15 weeks, and hence their limit was okay, increased risk to the mother, that sort of thing. And so I could see him writing that opinion,
but where he would move the line from viability back to 15 weeks.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily that all of a sudden it's a stark line where the state's interest were at viability, but it's kind of a sliding scale. And so, but I think that's obviously problematic for a lot of reasons. But we're kind of on the same page here. Neither of us really thinks that is going to happen. So if that ends up being the case, we're both right on this, then as far as I can tell, it would be the first time in the history of the Supreme Court that an individual right's been declared and then revoked, right? I mean, I guess you could argue that.
I wasn't ready for that question. Otherwise, I would have done some more research.
Well, here's what I'm thinking.
I'm thinking on it.
Now, while you're thinking on that, you could say, well, okay, the Lochner-era court declared a right of contract and then reversed that, but
I want to work 80 hours a week at the bakery.
But yeah, exactly. That was much more a right of businesses to not be bound by those kind of maximum hour worker regulations, sort of thing. So I think you could technically maybe say that was an individual right as well, but it feels very different, I would say. But aside from that, you could say, well, what about the death penalty cases? There was Furman and Gregg, but that really was not an issue with the constitutionality of the death penalty itself. It was how it was carried out, and there were all these weird different opinions and so forth. So that didn't quite fit that mold either. So again, as far as I can tell, this would be the first time that the court has ever reversed itself, having previously granted a pretty clear individual right. So yeah. Which is something.
I don't want to commit to that before I.
No, I totally get that. So we will come back to that,
or chime in through your
absolutely. But
email or if you have an idea of a individual right that has been granted and was taken away by the court,
definitely. So, but before we get into kind of the post-Roe world or country, actually, I thought that it might be helpful, both for us and for listeners, to get some sort of context here that I think is sometimes missing from some of these discussions. For instance, around 91% of abortions happen by 13 weeks. And then this is according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. So when we're looking at limits and time limits and week limits, that sort of thing, I think that's relevant, certainly, if legislatures can set whatever limits that they want. And then,
in other words, the Mississippi ban
15 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, would not affect 90% of abortions, thereabouts.
Right, thereabouts.
If I'm
exactly.
extrapolating those numbers.
Yeah. And if we look at another study, this is from 2018, found that women know in the U.S. know that they're pregnant on average around 5.5 weeks after the fact, and around 95% of women know within 10 weeks. There's a kind of a slight spike at 12 weeks, but pretty much most women know that they're pregnant. And I bring this up, I think it's important because there's that period between a woman knowing that she's pregnant and having to make that decision. And so that has to factor into those decisions, right? And as you might expect, the women who find out, who realize they're pregnant later, tend to be disproportionately younger. And by that, I mean under 20, poorer and non-white. Which also I think is an important factor to consider as well. And then there's just the number of abortions, right? According to the CDC from 2019, which is the last year they're reporting data from, there were 629,898 abortions in the U.S. That's just under 2% of pregnancies in that year ended in abortion. And so, there was always this thing on the left, and there still is, I'm sure, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And 2%. Does that meet that criteria? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And that's a rate that also has been dropping over the last decade in really in every state.
And it's been dropping tremendously even since Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty long-term drop, and there's no real clear correlation between the restrictiveness of laws in these declines. So that would obviously, I would expect, change if they're going to be outright bans, which there haven't been able to be.
Mike, I'd chime in.
Please do.
That my sense, my guess is, without having hard numbers on this, is that the decline is more due to availability, reliability of birth control compared to what it was
that might make,
in 1973.
Yeah, that would totally make sense, not having the data, but that seems like a very reasonable supposition. I would be inclined to agree with that. Absolutely. And then there's, public opinion on this, right? Because if it's going to be an issue that legislatures are going to decide, they're going to look at that. Now, a few months ago, the Pew Research Center gathered some data on this. They found that 61% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in most cases, and around 25% are essentially absolutists on that. Legal in all instances at all times, pretty much.
Up to the first year.
Well, and now on the pro-life side, there are around 10% that are anti-abortion absolutists, like under no conditions, rape, incest, doesn't matter. And around 27% believe that abortion should be illegal in most instances. So I think it's kind of helpful to think about those things when we're thinking about how legislatures might act on this. And I'm wondering, is there anything, you mentioned one thing already, is there anything else that maybe jumps out at you, strikes you about those stats, anything that might be particularly relevant to legislatures or Congress now that it seems like either or is going to be able to, at least try to pass legislation on this?
So no, I was going to add one other sort of factoid that I saw a week or so ago. And again, I haven't done all the background research on this, but this estimate was that 92%, if the matter went to the states, right, and you're going to predict what states did what, or which states already have the automatic bans that would come into effect if Roe v. Wade is struck down, 92% of abortions would still occur. Right, because you have a massing of a lot of those abortions occur in states that are deep blue and have zero to no restrictions, and would continue to have them in a post-Roe environment. And that again, the idea of this is going to be a massive change.
Right, I see what you're saying, and a number of them are higher population states like California, New York, that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
The life is not really going to change for you.
Yeah. So, again, this is not to suggest, certainly from my side, not to suggest that I agree that with Justice Alito that abortion is not the right to terminate a pregnancy is not a fundamental right. But given that seems to be what the interpretation is going to be that legislatures are going to have to live under, I think it's important to keep those things in mind. And so, I mean, I think you're right. It seems to me that on the ground, for a lot of folks, things are not necessarily going to change. But certainly, if you're a pro-life person, you say, well, there probably is going to be a not insignificant decrease in the number of abortions overall. And hey, if by doing this we can ensure that a few tens of thousands more children are born as opposed to fetuses aborted, that's worth everything that we fought for.
Yeah,
right?
And if there are 600 or 700,000 abortions a year, if you reduce that number by 1%, right?
Yeah.
That's 7,000 babies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not insignificant. You're a right to lifer.
And if you're a pro-choicer, that the logic works the same way in the other direction, certainly. So yeah, I mean, but it seems to me also that there's the possibility of there being not just state action, because of course that's been a long-standing thing. Right? Let the states decide, and pretty clearly, a state like Mississippi is going to decide differently than a state like Massachusetts if it's not seen as a fundamental right. But there's also now the possibility of congressional action. Right? This week, Senate Democrats tried to move forward a bill called the Women's Health Protection Act, and that would have basically given women across the country the right to terminate a pre-viability pregnancy without any of the various restrictions that sort of anti-abortion predominant states have imposed, ostensibly in the name of safety or informed consent. And so the idea behind the legislation being that you can't put in any other safeguards, if you will, that aren't normally in place for other elective surgical procedures of kind of a similar nature sort of thing. And that, of course, would have required 60 votes to get through a filibuster, but it didn't even get a majority. You had 49 Democratic senators in support. Then you had, I'm going to start calling him Republicrat, Joe Manchin, not in support with all the Republicans. And there was a companion bill of this that passed in the House in September, a very close vote, 218 to 211, as you would expect, almost entirely party line. There was only one Democrat who joined every Republican voting against that sort of thing. And so I guess there are a couple questions I have for you, Jay, on this. First off, what do you think about federal legislation in general on this? And
I'm against it.
Okay, Mike, and explain why.
You have to say on this, right? Just
yeah, that's true. Why so?
So again, it comes down to that government. If we're going to believe in government by the people, I think it makes most sense that the government that is closest to the people is the most responsive to it, right? And you can have states which are, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, laboratories of democracy. I think it was Holmes. Was it Holmes, or did I goof that up?
I don't know. It's always safe to attribute things to Holmes, So yeah.
No, but the idea being that what is acceptable to the people of California might not be acceptable to the people of Oklahoma or Mississippi. And as a federal system, those folks have a right to kind of decide how things go in their state. Again, we're at this point where we're already assuming that it's not a fundamental constitutional right, so it is governed by states. Secondly, I think the states give you more room to compromise, more room to craft something that works for them. As you mentioned earlier, the vast majority of people in the country, polls show, are conflicted on abortion, and they don't think abortion should be used as just a regular substitute for birth control. They have big problems with, say, abortion for reasons of sex selection or something like that. But they have problems with late-term abortions. But that line is hazier and it's tougher much early on, right? And I think there are a lot of those folks who could say, here's where I am. Look, I think a partial birth abortion DNX procedure is abhorrent. But you know what? I don't oppose a morning after Plan B pill. I think there are a whole lot of people who fall into that range. And as you pointed out, most of the abortions take place before the Mississippi limit would kick in. And I think these are issues that state legislators can work out for the, as they see fit for their states. And you're going to get different results in different states. You're going to have places like California and New York where you will have abortion will likely be legal up until the absolute minute of birth. or as some has even suggested, maybe a little bit after. Um, but I, as someone who's pro-life, am I happy with that? Not particularly. But as someone who's pro-democracy, yeah, I mean these are tough, difficult issues, and this is the place that they ought to be worked out. And you know what? When these debates happen, I mean, then people can go out and they can march on the state house, right? And they can wave signs and they can lobby their state legislators, which all makes a lot more sense than trying to march outside Supreme Court justices' houses.
I, I am on the side of those sort of safe, legal, and rare Democrats, which is most Democrats, or a lot of Democrats certainly. And so I'm a little conflicted because I also agree, just more generally with you about government closest to the people making decisions. And so, but you would think that on the surface that would mean I would be against this legislation, but weirdly, I'm not, because if you are, like I am, a Democrat who believes that there actually is a fundamental right at stake here, then, and you feel that the Supreme Court is erring in not in rescinding this right, then you have to say, well, what are our options? Well, basically to do a second best and sort of enshrine this right in law as kind of a second best option sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, I don't know that's the second best. I'm not saying that even enshrining it in law is second best or first best. I'm saying that the law ought to be at the state level rather than the federal level.
But you're also you also would agree that if there's something that you would see as a fundamental right, that's not something the states get to decide, or the Congress gets to decide, for that matter.
Right, but it's not a matter of whether I see it as a fundamental right or not. It's whether the Supreme Court is seen as
right. What I'm saying is, if you believe that the court is wrong in that, then that maybe changes the calculation. It certainly did for me, because we're dealing with, I believe, a fundamental right here, and an egregiously incorrect Supreme Court decision.
So in that case, you're essentially would argue that Congress should step in when there is this kind of issue, as opposed to leaving it to the states.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
This
I'm not
specific class.
I'd say that's an intellectually defensible position.
Well, thank you. I try to have one of those every once in a while.
Yeah, no. Like I said, I think it's better at the state level. I think there could also be challenges to, is this a general federal police power, right? Yeah. And that's I think troubling. And is there the Commerce Clause issues? Now, look, you certainly made the Commerce Clause issue that relates to travel and medical care, and people travel for medical. So look, there's those arguments would be there. I think it would also be like sort of these state preemption sort of argument. The states have already occupied the field on this. But
I think if there were,
what I'm saying is, I still think a legislation passed by Congress is still better than edicts from the court.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and I would, generally speaking, I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
So let's think about this now in terms of.
And Mike, I want to say there's a judge here in the Sixth Circuit, which handles Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and he does these talks, and one of the questions he begins with is, what regime would you rather live under? Would you rather, if you had to choose, if you could pick between living under the Brown versus Board of Education, or the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which would you choose?
Yeah, the latter.
And once you think it through, but everyone says, well, yeah, the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's, as a general principle, that's a great place to start. I'm with you entirely on that. So, yeah. So moving on, though, to those political ramifications, I mean, how do you see this affecting politics, first in the midterms, most obviously, because we're only a few months away from that. We're already into the primaries. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then even into the 2024 elections.
So I don't see that impacting the midterms a whole lot. I mean, I think it energizes the Democrat base. But I think the people for whom this is a really big issue are already going to vote anyway, right? It's I don't think you've had the folks who are really strong abortion rights activists who are sort of on the fence, or even lukewarm abortion rights activists. I think they're going to vote Democrat, and they would continue to do so, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, that's essentially my take. I don't see a lot of movement either way. You know, we're already pretty polarized, and though I do think that at the margins, it will probably help Democrats a little bit, but not nearly enough to say allow them to keep the House and probably
I
not
think
the Senate.
I think it gets a little bump in intensity, but to me, it's again as the Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, exactly. And so, looking even a little bit further out into the future, I mean, it's a long way until 2024, and anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen is just, kind of full of it. But it seems to me that in that very uncertain environment, I can easily paint a picture. In fact, to me, the most likely picked outcome is Donald Trump winning another term and having majorities in both chambers, and majorities that are going to be in both chambers Trumpier, and at least in the Senate, a larger majority than he had the first time around, because Donald Trump came in 2017, was +2 in the Senate, +47 in the House. Now, if you kind of look at the lay of the land now, the House margin might not change a whole lot from what he saw that last time, but he's likely to have a few more senators on his side. And so I can easily see a situation in which, well, there are enough votes to end the filibuster no matter what Mitch McConnell's saying, even if it's just for, I don't know, protecting unborn life or something like that. And I mean, that doesn't seem to me to be a crazy sort of way of looking at it where pro-life activists say, wait a second, we can't countenance sort of situation where California and Massachusetts and all these states are allowing this crazy stuff, not when you can act now that the Supreme Court has let you act. And I think there might be a big enough majority and enough pressure from those groups to actually force the matter. What am I being too apocalyptic about that?
I would disagree.
Okay.
Well, let's put it this way. I would hopefully disagree. It's one of those like
Yeah.
say to me, I hope you're wrong, or I hope you're right. Because I would think most folks in the pro-life movement would realize that if you get rid of the filibuster, we could end up in a horrible situation, right? Where we're flipping back and forth on this issue every 2 years. So I mean, it's sort of like the only idea that would be sort of worse than our regime of having the court make these decisions would be having the Congress do it and no filibuster speed bump, and we'll just be flipping back. I think that would be.
Well, see that's where part two comes in, Jay. Is where after the Republican Congress passes that, then they also put in another exception for the filibuster for election integrity, election security measures, and so kind of sort of bake in a little more of the structural advantages that Republicans have for various reasons to kind of secure that. So it'd have to be, a package sort of thing, not necessarily in the same vote, but during the same term. And I can easily see a 2025 kind of shaping up that way, at which point, I don't know, Kimberly and I are in Uruguay or Chile or something like that and saying, hey, that's not good. But anyway.
I do think, and again, I don't know, right? I hope you're wrong.
Sure, me too.
But I would think most Republicans, most conservatives would, as their conservative kind of nature, be against. They would be, for one thing, intuitively institutionalist, right? And would reject that sort of, hey, let's get rid of the filibuster. I would have to think that would be the default position.
Well, see, I would like to share your faith that a significant plurality or even a significant minority of Republicans are what you and I would recognize as conservatives. But I don't know that I feel that's true anymore. It's a better world if it is true, for sure.
And it's not. There are conversations on the right that people have these very concerns. I think I told you this was a couple months ago, but again, the geeky analogy of the Ring of Power and Boromir, and or the idea of like, look, if I take the ring, I'll use it for good. But no, it will corrupt you in the end. And the true conservative position is that that power corrupts, and yeah, the idea that if we have the power, we'll do the right thing. That should be guarded against at all costs.
It's funny you mentioned that, and it made me think of. I showed one of my American politics class a film called The Swamp, which featured a number of mainly Republicans who were trying to drain Freedom Caucus guys. One of them was Thomas Massey, who I personally found very engaging to talk to. I disagree with him on a lot, but he had this long analogy where he talked about his congressional pin, and you know what I'm talking about, those pins that all members of Congress wear. He's like he tries to wear it as little as possible, he says, because it's like Precious from Lord of the Rings, where everyone is just you feel special and it's all this power, and he says it just kind of creeps him out in a way. And I'm like, I don't agree with him on a lot, but I really appreciate that kind of viewpoint on power, at least, that there are some people who still seem to hold that, whether or not I agree with them on matters of policy. And I think there's too little of that on both sides, actually, these days.
Yeah.
So
anyway, I mean, that would be my take, because I would think and I would hope that most Republicans would have that.
Me too.
That sense that you don't want to. Again, there ought to be sort of a counter-majoritarian sort of impulse that's part of conservatism.
Well, let's hope so, for sure. So, kind of along the same lines, I guess, maybe we can talk, I think it relates to this, right? Because there were primary elections this week. And, I think it may say some things about Donald Trump's hold over the Republican Party. Elections in West Virginia and Nebraska, and normally, of course, we don't talk a lot about primary elections. These might matter because, last week before, right, there's this come from behind win by J.D. Vance, exactly, and but this week,
or as you may have, as Trump calls him, JP or J.D. Mandel,
that guy, yeah, exactly, whoever.
He's doing great. He's doing great stuff.
But so okay, this week. This last week, Trump has a big win. There's an incumbent versus incumbent contest in West Virginia because West Virginia has lost a congressional seat. And the new district seemed like it should favor incumbent one, David McKinley, over the Trump-endorsed incumbent Alex Mooney, but Mooney won easily. But there's Nebraska, on the other hand. Trump endorses Charles Herbster, who was defeated narrowly, in a multi-candidate race, I think 3%, by Jim Pillins in the University of Nebraska Regent, who was also backed by the term-limited departing Governor Pete Ricketts. So I should also mention that to this point, Trump-endorsed candidates have won 39 out of 40 times in primaries that have been held to this point. But, and I know you're getting ready to say this, Jay, I'll say it for you, doesn't mean a whole lot because most of those races weren't even contested. So let's just look at contested races. Well, you can argue there were really probably about 7 of those. The Trump candidate has won in 6 of those. Only Herbster's lost. And that one, his candidate, there were these accusations of sexual harassment by 8 women, including a Republican state senator, and issues, I think, about him taking his business out of state or something like that. So right now, at least, based on what we've seen to this point, it seems like Donald Trump, you can make a case, certainly, that Donald Trump's seal of approval means an awful lot in Republican primaries. So maybe you have a different perspective on this. I don't know. I'm interested in hearing it.
I'd say it certainly doesn't hurt. And I think it helps. The extent to which it makes a difference, I think we could debate. I'm trying to find a article right now, but as we speak. But I think, for one thing, every race comes down to its own people, right? I think especially in Senate races and bigger races. So it's not just Donald Trump. Looking at the Ohio race, right? On the one hand, it helped. Then you can say, well, look, J.D. Vance did kind of, it wasn't necessarily come from behind. He was in the top 2. But you also have to factor in, he got a ton of money from Peter Thiel late in the game. And if you also look at the Ohio numbers, and I do have these pulled up in front of me. It was a wide open race, and there were like 5 candidates. So 68% of Ohio Republicans ignored or rejected Trump's endorsement. Right? They voted for someone other than Vance. I mean, he won with whatever 20.
It was
23%.
Yeah. But it seems. But I guess
last print 32% on election day. He was 23% before the endorsement.
But I mean, that's the problem, right? Here, at least how I see it is there are a lot of states like Ohio. I mean, the fact of the matter is unless something bizarre happens, J.D. Vance is going to be the next senator from the state of Ohio. I mean, Tim Ryan, God bless him. I'm sure he's going to do his best.
Tim Ryan, who is trying to run as Trumpy as possible.
Yeah,
now.
exactly. Sure. I mean, because he wants to at least, not lose by a lot, right? But the thing is in a lot of these races, the primary is the election. Right. And so what that means is it sets up a situation where if more and more of these folks feel like they owe something to Donald Trump, well, that could potentially have some pretty significant ramifications down the line. Because, of course, in 2016, 2017, it's not like anyone felt that they owed anything pretty much to Donald Trump. Right. He surprised the hell out of everyone. But now this sets the stage for a Congress and potentially in 2025 that is far more compliant to whatever Donald Trump might want to do. A Donald Trump who doesn't have to worry about re-election, right? So who can do essentially, is maybe even more unleashed, unhinged, whatever word you want to use. And so I'm not trying to be apocalyptic about it, but I can certainly understand.
You're moving to Uruguay.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I can certainly understand people who look at this set of statistics, this set of facts, I guess, and the fact of the matter of how primaries work and how the Republican primaries, especially for the presidency, work, and saying that, well, this is what draws out the most extreme voters and so forth. And, and so I don't know, that it seems to me to be the most likely scenario. And that's depressing to me. A world in which Jane Timken, the establishment candidate, right?
The chair of the party.
Yeah, can't even get in the top 5, I think. I think she finished in 5th place. That's a world that I'm sad to live in.
Yeah. I didn't know you liked Jane Timken that much.
Well, I like.
Well, and also, I would say it's a little ironic because Jane Timken was a Trumper.
Yeah,
she was essentially put into, took leadership role of the party in sort of a Trumpian coup.
Yeah, I mean, and yet she was not nearly. I use the word again, unhinged enough, right? Because you had Vance and Mandel going at it like a bunch of rabid weasels, essentially. And,
but I think also you had Mandel, who was kind of almost more unhinged.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Right. I think that was something. He was, like I said, he was Trumpy without Trump. He was beyond Trump.
Yeah. You mean Donald Trump looks at him and goes, "Wow, that guy's got some impulse control issues."
No, I think so. Yeah. So, and part of this, look, I'm looking at the Ohio experience just because that's what I'm closest to. But you have a situation where you had multiple candidates, everyone trying to sort of out-Trump each other, except for Dolan. Dolan was the only one who took the completely other route.
He hung in there for a little while, at least.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is still the majority of Ohio Republican voters voted for the non-Trump candidate, strong majority.
Yeah, and I think
so. I think there's something to be said for the endorsement. That I think it certainly helped. Did it put him over the top, give him that extra couple? Yeah, I think so. Is that going to happen in every race? No, it's going to happen in some races.
Yeah, but you would agree, right, with my ultimate conclusion that assuming Donald Trump is reelected in 2024, that the Congress he gets is going to be a more pro-Trump Congress than he had in 2017?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's put it this way: no one who was running for Congress in 2016 expected the Trump would be president.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's just almost by default, right? Yeah.
We would be beholden to Donald Trump. I'm like, why? What's he going to do to me under President Clinton? But
So then, to me, then that means that it's more than ever. It's Donald Trump's party, and the Jay Carsons of the Republican Party are just sort of you're kind of like a backseat passenger here on this MAGA Express.
Well, to be sure, my endorsement carries less weight.
Just slightly, yeah.
I think there's going to be Trump fatigue.
You keep on saying that, and I hope you're right, but I don't know. I don't know. I think, maybe.
And look, I could be wrong.
I'm tired of them, so yeah, I buy it on
it's working. No, I do think Republicans historically have tended to be less enamored of a candidate, of a person, right? That's the Chris Matthews thing of we just typically don't have candidates that give us tingles down our legs, right?
Ronald Reagan.
But even thinking about Reagan, it wasn't sort of like the Barack Obama moment, right? You didn't have people fainting in the aisles with Ronald Reagan. I think people saw Reagan as very much a better choice than Jimmy Carter, and in his second term, very much a better choice than Walter Mondale. But I don't think there's a tendency amongst Republicans to get as attached to a savior type figure. At least historically.
I think historically you're right. I think that's changed, but yeah,
right. I mean, because
sure.
To me, again, someone and Ronald Reagan he wasn't necessarily Ronald Reagan in 1980 or even 1984, right?
No, he became.
He's also kind of taken on a historical gloss that wasn't necessarily there at the time.
Absolutely.
So I can remember people griping about bailing out Chrysler.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking of Donald Trump in terms of his historical gloss as opposed to his
I'm just saying. Look, there were people, conservatives at the time.
Who
were saying, Reagan's not being tough enough on Russia, and look, he's bailing out domestic auto.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we will see. Let's hope that Trump fatigue becomes
and conservatives
a real thing.
Certainly had issues with George W. Bush.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely with him. Okay, well, if you are a Politics Guys supporter, the rest of the episode is coming right up. We're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff, that COVID summit, Ukraine, Russia news, inflation down a little bit, maybe, we'll see. The markets, China tariffs, and I already mentioned, will I be leaving the country for Latin America in the next few years? Well, we'll talk about why I might be doing that and if that's an okay.
Vaya con Dios.
Exactly. Anyway, if you are a supporter, you'll be getting that in just a second. If you're not, a quick reminder, full episodes, ad-free, run usually around 2 hours or so, available to all of our Patreon supporters, as well as anyone who's not in the position to financially support the podcast. And to become a Patreon supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys, as well as through PayPal. And you can find all that in the show notes or at politicsguys.com/support. And if you would like to get that full access, but again, you're not in that financial position to support the show, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get you all set up with that. And whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you could spread the word by subscribing, rating the show, and leaving a review on whatever podcast app you happen to use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. Thanks so much.